The Hall of Reconciliation stood where the Overlord Council Chamber had been, and the architecture remained Krell. Because humanity understood that forcing cultural erasure would only breed resentment, but the purpose had changed from dominance to cooperation, and the difference matter, Admiral Chen addressed the inaugural session of the Galactic Accord with representatives from 40 species, present including Krell moderates who had survived the Civil War, and she chose her words carefully. Because this moment would define the next era of galactic civilization, we are here not because humanity defeated the Krell Dominion, she began, but because countless species chose freedom over submission and cooperation over conquest, and the Accord exists to ensure no species ever again suffers what the Dominion inflicted. Around the chamber, representatives responded, according to their cultural norms, and some stood in respect while others made sounds of agreement, and the Krell delegates remained seated because their culture had no tradition of honoring equals. But Chen noted they attended it all, and that was progress-thexional. Sat in the human delegation section wearing simple clothes rather than armor, because his role now was diplomat and cultural liaison, and he still struggled with the concept that humans had granted him asylum rather than execution beside him sat Captain Maria Santos, who had lost family in the early Krell raids, and had every reason to hate him, but instead worked with him daily translating Krell concepts into human understanding. And somehow they had developed something approaching professional respect. "Do you think this will work, Thexno?" asked quietly while the formal speeches continued. "And can species who were hunter and prey learn to coexist?" And his doubt was evident because Krell psychology struggled with power relationships that were not hierarchical. "I do not know," Santos replied honestly, "but humanity spent 10,000 years fighting ourselves before we learned to cooperate, and if we can overcome tribal instincts, then perhaps the galaxy can too." And her tone suggested she believed it, despite evidence to the contrary. The Accord's founding principles were simple, but revolutionary. No species had the right to subjugate another, and conflicts would be resolved through arbitration rather than warfare, and mutual defense agreements would protect members from external threats, and economic cooperation would benefit all rather than enriching conquerors. Critics called it naive idealism, and military strategists warned that unified command structures were inefficient, and cultural traditionalists from multiple species claimed it violated natural order. But Chen pushed forward, because the alternative was returning to cycles of conquest and revenge. The war crimes tribunals began 3 months after the Accord's founding, and they were ugly and necessary because justice required accountability even when accountability was uncomfortable. Lord Krextel stood trial for ordering the deaths of millions across dozens of worlds. And the evidence was overwhelming and presented by survivors who testified about atrocities committed in the name of Krell supremacy. "I regret nothing," Krextel declared when given opportunity to speak. "And the Krell are apex predators, and we acted according to our nature, and you cannot judge a hunter for hunting." And his defiance was absolute, even facing execution. Watched from the gallery and felt no satisfaction because Krextel genuinely believed his words, and the Krell culture that produced him had never taught alternatives to dominance through violence. Tribunal convicted him and 12 other overlords, who refused to acknowledge their crimes, and the sentences were carried out publicly because the species they had victimized needed closure, and deterrence mattered for future generations. But tribunals also showed mercy to Krell commanders who had surrendered and cooperated, and who expressed genuine remorse, and Thexenol testified at several trials explaining how Dominion culture had normalized atrocity, and individual choice still mattered. Some convicts received reduced sentences in exchange for helping rebuild worlds they had destroyed, and the symbolism was powerful as former conquerors labored alongside species they had once hunted. The economic reconstruction proved more complex because the Dominion had built its wealth on resource extraction and slave labor, and transitioning to voluntary cooperation required complete economic restructuring. Dr. Okonkwo led the medical aid programs, bringing human medical technology to species who had never received health care under Krell rule, and she worked 18-hour days treating injuries and illnesses that should have been prevented decades ago. the Krell never invested in civilian infrastructure. She reported during an Accord Council meeting an entire populations live in conditions humans would consider medieval, and we are finding medical conditions we thought were extinct because the Dominion simply did not care if subject species suffered. The Accord approved massive humanitarian aid packages, and human engineers deployed across former Dominion space building hospitals and schools and infrastructure that served population needs rather than military objectives. Krell workers participated in these projects, and many struggled with the concept that labor could produce value beyond enriching masters in one. Krell engineer told Santos, "We built monuments to our power, and you build schools for children, and I do not understand. Which is stronger? Give it time," Santos replied. "And strength that helps rather than hurts lasts longer than strength that only destroys." And the engineer returned to work thoughtful in ways Krell rarely allowed themselves to. Beatty military integration proved easiest because soldiers understood chains of command and tactical cooperation, and human officers worked with Krell warriors to develop combined unit tactics. Former enemies trained together, and initially tensions ran high with incidents of violence between species who had recently been trying to kill each other, but gradually professional respect emerged based on competence rather than species. A Dexian squad leader saved a Krell warrior during a pirate suppression operation, and the Krell publicly thanked him using human customs, and the footage went viral across Accord space because it showed that old hatreds could be overcome. The education programs targeted the next generation because adults might never fully abandon old prejudices, but children could learn different values. Human teachers worked in Krell schools, introducing concepts like empathy and cooperation and critical thinking, and some Krell parents protested that this weakened their offspring, but others saw their children questioning dominance, hierarchies, and thought perhaps change was necessary. Young Krell, who grew up under the Accord, began to see other species as potential allies rather than prey or competitors, and the shift was gradual but measurable in attitude. Surveys and behavioral studious Thexanol became the face of Krell integration, and he traveled across Accord space, giving speeches about learning from mistakes and choosing adaptation over extinction and building something better than what had been destroyed. "My people believed we were apex predators," he told university students on a human colony world, "and we were wrong because apex predators do not need to evolve, and humanity taught us that intelligence and adaptation matter more than claws and armor." A student asked him, "Do you regret the raids and the deaths your forces caused?" And the question was direct in ways that made his handlers nervous. But Dexanol had learned that humans valued honesty every day. He replied, "And I cannot change what happened, but I can work to ensure it never happens again, and that is why I served the Accord." And the auditorium was silent because they had expected political answers, not genuine remorse. Jin retired from active military service 3 years after the war's end and accepted a position as Accord Defense Coordinator, overseeing the integration of multiple species military forces into coherent peacekeeping operations. She found the work frustrating because coordinating 40 species with different tactical doctrines and communication methods and cultural assumptions was harder than fighting wars, but it was also necessary. "We are building something unprecedented," she told her staff during a particularly difficult negotiation about fleet deployment protocols. "And no one has ever successfully maintained peace among this many species, and we will make mistakes, but we learn from them." The pirate clans that had exploited Dominion collapsed, tested Accord resolve, and found it stronger than expected because combined fleets responded faster and with more precision than any single species could manage. Major pirate base was eliminated in a joint operation involving human strategic planning and Krell ground assault and Dexian technical expertise, and the coordination was imperfect, but effective. This is what the Accord means, Chen announced in her after-action report, and former enemies working together to protect civilians. And that is worth more than any military victory. 10 years after the war's end, the Galactic Accord had grown to include 60 species and covered 1/3 of known space, and threats still existed, but they were external rather than internal. The Krell homeworld had transformed from military stronghold to cultural center, and young Krell artists created works that explored themes of redemption and growth and the painful process of abandoning Supremacist ideologist Sinel stood on a balcony overlooking the capital city where monuments to conquest had been replaced by parks and museums and educational centers, and he thought about how far his people had come. Santos joined him, and they stood in comfortable silence. The Krell homeworld of Krellnax hung in space like a jewel built from conquest and blood and from orbit admiral. Chen could see the planetary defense grid that had protected the minion capital for 3,000 cycles, and she knew her fleet would take heavy casualties breaking through those defenses, but casualties were acceptable when weighed against ending a war that had already cost billions of lives across dozens of species, and besides, human forces had learned to minimize losses through planning and precision and overwhelming coordinated firepower. All task forces report ready, her tactical officer announced, and Chen took a moment to appreciate the magnitude of what was about to happen, because humanity had gone from defending their home system to attacking the capital of a galactic empire in less than 2 years. Beside her on the bridge stood Thexanal in restraints that were more symbolic than necessary, because the former Krell commander had been cooperative and invaluable, and his intelligence had allowed human forces to outmaneuver Dominion fleets across a dozen sectors. They will fight to the death, Thexanal said quietly while watching the tactical displays, and the overlords would rather see their world burn than admit defeat to species they considered prey, and his tone carried resignation and perhaps shame. Then we will give them that option, Chen replied, and we will broadcast surrender terms one final time, and those who accept will live, and those who refuse will face the consequences of their choice. And she meant every word, because human mercy had limits them. The message went out across all frequencies in Krell language and human language and every other language spoken by Dominion subject species: complete and unconditional surrender with guarantees of fair treatment under laws of war, or total bombardment until defensive capabilities were eliminated. The response from the Overlord Council was predictable: defiant rejection and threats, and promises that Krell warriors would tear humans apart with their bare claws. And Chen had expected nothing less, because empires built on supremacy could not accept reality until reality forced acceptance. All ships, she ordered, commence operation. Hammerfall and 300 human warships, plus twice that many vessels from allied species, began their assault on Fortress World. Krellnax's battle was brutal and devastating, and everything Chen had predicted, because Krell defenders fought with fanatical intensity, and their weapon systems were sophisticated, and their tactics desperate. And in the first hour alone, humanity lost 20 ships and 4,000 crew, but human forces pressed forward using combined arms doctrine developed across centuries of warfare, and they targeted defense platforms with railgun salvos, while strike craft eliminated point defense systems, and capital ships pushed through gaps created by coordinated assault. Thexanal watched the battle unfold and saw his people dying in defense of leaders he cared nothing for their lives, and he felt something he had never experienced before. A doubt about everything the Krell Dominion represented. Your people die bravely, Chen observed without looking at him, and it is unfortunate. Their courage is wasted defending a system that treated other species as prey animals. And her tone was not mocking, but genuinely regretful, because she took no pleasure in necessary slaughter on the surface of Krellnax. The population watched orbital battles through public displays, and some cheered, believing Dominion forces would repel the attackers, but others saw human ships breaking through defensive lines and wondered if perhaps the galaxy had changed. In the Overlord Council chamber, the ruling body of the Dominion argued even as explosions lit the sky above their city, and Overlord Krextil demanded total commitment of remaining forces, while other overlords suggested evacuation or negotiation. We cannot negotiate with prey, Krextil roared, using the threat displays that had intimidated subordinates for decades. And we are Krell, and we do not bow to lesser species. But his words rang hollow, because outside the chamber windows human ships were systematically destroying everything the Dominion had built. Junior Overlord named Vexron, who had risen through ranks by military competence rather than political maneuvering, finally spoke what others were thinking. Perhaps the humans were never prey, and perhaps we were wrong, And if we continue this path, the Krell species will be extinct within a generation. Attack Thexron physically in the council chamber, because among Krell dominance was established through violence. But other overlords intervened, and for the first time in Dominion history, the ruling council fractured into open conflict outside. The Chamber Krell military commanders faced impossible choices: follow overlord orders and fight to extinction, or surrender against every cultural instinct and hope for mercy from an enemy they had hunted for sportsome. Commanders chose death and led their forces in suicidal attacks against human formations, and they died bravely but uselessly, because courage without strategy was just waste. Others chose pragmatism and withdrew their forces from combat and broadcast surrender signals and were shocked when human ships actually held fire and provided coordinates for prisoner processing centers on the planet. Surface resistance cells formed by subject species rose up against their Krell overseers using weapons and training provided by human intelligence services, and suddenly the Dominion was fighting civil war. Alongside invasion, Chen watched all of this from her flagship and felt no satisfaction, because war was never glorious regardless of what propaganda suggested and every death represented someone's family member or friend or loved one, and the numbers were staggering on both sides, Admiral. Her communications officer said, "We are receiving a priority transmission from the surface, and it is from Overlord Thexron, and he is requesting formal negotiation." And Chen nodded, because this was the moment everything had been building toward, though. Negotiations occurred aboard the Lincoln, with Thexron arriving under heavy guard and looking diminished without his council chamber and throne and the trappings of power that had defined his existence. "I speak for a faction of the Overlord Council," he began, and his translator rendered Krell clicks and growls into human words, "and we recognize that continued resistance means extinction, and we are prepared to discuss terms of surrender." Chen studied him carefully, because she had learned to read Krell body language from that xenol, and what she saw was not submission but calculation, because Thexron was still trying to salvage what he could from defeat. Complete and unconditional surrender, she stated flatly, in war crimes tribunals. For all overlords and commanders who ordered attacks on civilian populations and reparations to every species harmed by Dominion aggression and integration into a new galactic order based on mutual cooperation. "Unacceptable," Thexron snarled, "and the Krell will never submit to judgment by prey species." But his protest lacked conviction, because he could see through the viewports. "Where human ships controlled the orbital space above his homeworld, then we will continue bombardment," Chen replied, standing to indicate the meeting was over. "And you can return to your council and explain why you chose pride over survival." She meant it, because humanity had committed to seeing this through, regardless of cause. Xern hesitated, and in that hesitation Chen saw what she needed: the crack in Krell's certainty that meant negotiation was possible if pressure was maintained. "I need time to convince the other council members," he said finally, "and many still believe we can fight our way to victory." And Chen almost laughed, because the delusion was staggering. "You have 6 hours," she told him, "and after that we resume bombardment. We will not stop until your defensive grid is completely destroyed and your industrial capacity is eliminated, and your ability to wage war is reduced to 0. Thexron left, and Thexnell, who had watched the entire exchange, spoke quietly. "He will try to buy time and rebuild, and the overlords do not understand that time favors you, because every day more subject species rebel, and more Krell commanders lose faith." "I know," Chen replied, "and that is why the deadline is real, and in 6 hours, we either get surrender or we eliminate the Dominion's capacity for organized resistance." And she was prepared for either outcome. What happened next surprised even Chen, because the Krell civil war that had been simmering below the surface erupted into open conflict as Overlord Krexdell attempted a coup against moderates in the council. Chamber became a battlefield. Dixrin barely escaped with his life and fled to the communications center, where he broadcast an unprecedented message. He surrendered his personal forces and called for all Krell military units to stand down, and he acknowledged human supremacy in the conflictory still, responded by ordering his loyalists to attack Thexron's position, but half the military refused orders because they could see that continued fighting meant extinction. The Dominion collapsed. Not from external pressure alone, but from internal contradictions that had been building for centuries in humanity. Had simply provided the catalyst that forced the choice between adaptation and death. Chen received the Exron surrender and immediately deployed peacekeeping forces to separate Krell factions and protect civilians, and begin the long process of transitioning from war to occupation to reconstruction. The Krell mothership, Endless Fang, hung in space above a conquered world, waiting for supplies that would never arrive, because 3 human destroyers had eliminated the convoy 6 hours ago, using tactics that would have seemed impossible to any Krell commander who still believed their species was invincible. Admiral Chen watched the engagement from her flagship, Lincoln, and allowed herself a moment of satisfaction because the plan was working exactly as designed, and humanity was no longer reacting to Krell aggression, but actively dismantling their empire, piece by piece. Target their communication arrays, she ordered, and her weapons officer complied without hesitation because they had learned that blind enemies made mistakes, and mistakes created opportunities. The Krell commander aboard Endless Fang never saw the missiles coming because human stealth technology had advanced past anything the Dominion possessed, and when his sensors finally detected the threat, it was already too late, and his ship went dark and silent, floating helpless in space. Send the boarding teams, Chen ordered, because intact Krell ships provided intelligence worth more than debris, and within minutes human Marines were cutting through the hull, using techniques developed specifically to counter Krell security systems inside the ship. The remaining Krell warriors fought with desperate ferocity because surrender was not part of their cultural programming. But humans had studied Krell psychology and knew exactly how to exploit their rigid honor codes and pack mentality. Isolate them into small groups, Lieutenant Commander Jackson directed her Marines, and force them to fight without pack coordination, and they will make mistakes. And the prediction proved accurate as separated Krell warriors attacked individually rather than waiting for tactical advantage. Within 2 hours, the mothership was secured, and Krell survivors were restrained, and the intelligence hall included complete tactical databases and communication, encryption codes and shipping schedules that would allow humans to predict Dominion movements for months. But Chen was not interested in defense anymore because humanity had shifted to total offensive warfare, and every Krell asset was now a legitimate target, and the goal was not just victory, but the complete collapse of Dominion power structures. In another sector, Captain Rodriguez led a task force deep into Krell territory, targeting not military installations, but economic infrastructure, because humans understood that empires ran on resources and logistics, and breaking supply chains was more effective than winning battles. Destroy the mining platforms, Rodriguez ordered, as his ships emerged from faster than light. Travel in a system the Krell considered secure, and transmit footage to every conquered species in range, because we want them to see their oppressors are vulnerable. The platforms burned, and the broadcasts went out and across a dozen worlds enslaved. Populations watched Krell economic power literally going up in flames, and hope began replacing despair because humanity had proven resistance was possible. Meanwhile, human intelligence services were conducting operations that would have been called terrorism if performed against civilians, but were considered justified warfare when targeting an empire built on predation and murder. Dr. Okonkwo's chemical weapons were deployed on Krell garrison worlds using delivery systems the Krell could not detect, and soldiers who had considered themselves invincible found their respiratory systems failing and their armor useless against an enemy they could not see or fight. Is this honorable one of Chen's junior officers asked after reviewing casualty reports from a chemical strike that killed 300 Krell warriors in their own barracks, and Chen fixed him with a stare that could freeze helium. The Krell hunted our civilians for sport, she said quietly, and broadcast their murders as entertainment, so we will use every weapon at our disposal until they surrender or die, and honor is a luxury reserved for peacetime. And the officer never questioned her orders again, but the most devastating attacks came from an unexpected direction. As the species humanity had armed and trained began winning their own battles against Krell occupation forces, and the Dominion suddenly faced rebellions on 20 fronts simultaneously. The Xians used human weapons and tactics to destroy a Krell command center on their homeworld and declared independence, And when the Dominion sent reinforcements, those ships were ambushed by human strike craft that had been waiting in the asteroid belt. The Zephyron hivemind coordinated uprisings across 3 systems using encrypted communications provided by human technology, and their telepathic network meant perfect tactical coordination that the Krell could not counter or predict. Other species watched and learned and realized the Krell were not invincible, and within months, the Dominion was fighting brushfire wars across their entire territory, while human forces struck at strategic targets with surgical precision. Thexanol watched his empire crumbling from the bridge of his warship, and wondered how everything had gone so wrong so quickly, because the Krell had ruled for 3,000 cycles without serious challenge. The humans are attacking Supply Depot 17, Vexther reported, with barely concealed panic, and they are using our own stolen ships with our identification codes, and by the time our forces realized the deception, the depot was already destroyed. This was the new reality. Humans fought without honor or mercy, and they used deception and subterfuge and psychological warfare and every dirty trick developed across 10,000 years of human conflict. We need reinforcements, Thexanol said, while studying tactical displays that showed human forces advancing on multiple fronts, and we need them now before the entire sector falls. But the Dominion Council was paralyzed by internal conflicts, as hardline commanders demanded total war, while moderates suggested negotiation, and the debate consumed resources and time that the Krell did not have. The overlords refused to acknowledge the scale of the problem, Vexther said bitterly, and they are executing commanders who retreat even when retreat is the only logical option, and this madness will destroy us faster than the humans. Knew his second was right, because the Dominion's rigid hierarchy could not adapt to asymmetric warfare, and humans were exploiting every structural weakness in Krell society and military organization. The crisis point came when human forces launched a coordinated assault on 3 Krell core colonies simultaneously, and the attacks were so well-timed and executed that Dominion defenses collapsed within hours. Chen herself led the attack on Krell Colony 7, bringing her entire battle group through hyperspace directly into orbit and broadcasting a simple message: surrender or die. The Krell garrison chose to fight because their culture demanded it, but they were fighting humans who had spent centuries perfecting orbital bombardment tactics, and within 6 hours the garrison was destroyed and the colony liberated. Offer the Krell survivors a choice, Chen ordered her subordinates, and those who surrender will be treated according to laws of war, but those who continue fighting will be shown the same mercy they showed our people. And the meaning was crystal clearsome. Krell surrendered and were shocked to receive medical treatment and prisoner rights because they expected torture or execution, and their reports filtered back to other Krell forces, creating confusion and doubt. Others fought to the death and were killed efficiently without ceremony or respect, because humans had learned not to waste resources on enemies who refused quarter. But the most significant development came when Nexanel made a decision that would have been unthinkable months earlier. Contacted human forces and requested a meeting under truce terms. This is madness, Vexther protested, and the overlords will execute you for even considering surrender. But Thexanol shook his head, because he had finally understood what made humans truly dangerous. I am not surrendering to save myself, he explained, but I have information that could save countless lives on both sides, and the Dominion is collapsing and the overlords are too proud to see it. But I am not. The meeting occurred on a neutral station with heavy security from both sides, and Thexanol found himself facing Admiral Chen across a simple table, and for the first time he truly understood what humans' workshoe was not large or heavily armored or naturally dangerous by Krell standards, but her eyes held an intelligence and determination that was more frightening than any physical threat, because those eyes had calculated the cost of destroying the Dominion and found it acceptable. You wanted to talk, Chen said, without preamble, so talk and convince me why. I should not have you arrested as a war criminal. And the Kezanol felt fear for the first time in his adult life, because I can give you the Krell homeworld, said, and watched her expression shift from skepticism to interest. and I can give you command codes and defensive positions and everything you need to end this war quickly with. Minimal casualties on both sides? Why would you betray your own people? Chen asked, and her tone suggested she already knew the answer, but wanted to hear him say it, because the Dominion is already dead, Dex. Admiral Chen stood in the war room deep beneath Geneva, watching holographic displays show another settlement burning under. Krell assault, and her expression remained cold and calculated because panic was a luxury humanity could not afford, and fear was something they would weaponize rather than succumb to around her the greatest military minds Earth had ever assembled worked with desperate intensity because they had exactly one. Its advantage over the Krell. Humans had spent 10,000 years perfecting the art of killing other humans, and that education was about to pay. Dividends show me the attack pattern analysis. She ordered, and Lieutenant Morrison brought up a three-dimensional map showing every Krell raid plotted by location. And time and tactics, and already patterns were emerging because the Krell fought like apex predators who had never needed to innovate. They used the same approach every time, Morrison explained, while highlighting the data point's maximum aggression, an overwhelming force applied at the weakest point, and they rely entirely on physical superiority rather than tactical complexity. And Chen nodded because she had seen this before in her studies of extinct predator species. The Krell were like the great cats of Earth who had ruled their environments for millions of years, until something smarter came along with tools and planning and the ability to learn, and humanity had been that something on their home world. What about their biology? Chen asked, turning to Dr. Sarah Okonkwo, who had been analyzing every piece of Krell tissue and technology recovered from the battlefields. Fascinating and exploitable, Okonkwo said with the enthusiasm of a scientist who had found a puzzle worth solving. Their armor plating is nearly impenetrable to conventional weapons, but the joints show weakness, and they have surprisingly poor chemical tolerance compared to humans. And she brought up molecular structures that meant nothing to Chen. But everything to the weapons developers listening. Can we weaponize that? Chen asked, because in war, everything was either a weapon or a target already working on it, Okonkwo confirmed. We are developing a compound that their respiratory system cannot filter, and early tests on captured tissue samples show promising results, and Chen made a note to fast-track production because Mercy was for peacetime, and this was very much war in. Another section of the complex military strategists were reviewing footage from every engagement and cataloging Krell behavior patterns, because predators were predictable once you understood their instincts, and humans had millennia of experience hunting Earth's most dangerous predators. They hunt in packs of 7 to 12 individuals, Captain James Rodriguez explained to his team, and they always established dominance. Hierarchy before engaging, which means killing the pack leader, creates temporary confusion in the others, and his team began designing tactics specifically to exploit this weakness. Meanwhile, in orbital shipyards above Earth, construction crews worked 20-hour shifts, building ships that incorporated everything learned from Krell technology, because humans were exceptional at reverse engineering and improving on designs that other species considered finished. Their shields are strong, but they cycle in a predictable pattern. Chief Engineer Park reported during the daily briefing, we can time our weapons to fire during the microsecond gaps, and our new railguns have enough kinetic force to penetrate their hull armor, and Chen approved immediate implementation across the fleet. The most important work was happening in small special operations centers where elite soldiers trained for missions that would have seemed suicidal to anyone who did not understand human psychology, because humans alone among known species had mastered the concept of acceptable casualties in pursuit of strategic objectives. Major Sarah Williams briefed her team on their next operation, while holographic displays showed a Krell supply depot on a captured mining world, and the mission was simple in concept, but brutal in execution. Infiltrate and destroy, and make the Krell understand they were no longer safe anywhere we go. And Quiet Williams explained plant charges on their ammunition storage and reactor core, and leave before they know we were there, and when it detonates, we want the explosion visible from orbit. And her team nodded because they had volunteered for this, knowing full well the odds of survival. Operation launched 3 days later, and 12 human commandos inserted via stealth pods onto a world where Krell hunters prowled, looking for easy prey, and for 18 hours the humans moved through enemy territory. Using every trick developed in Earth's Special Forces training, they bypassed Krell patrols using thermal camouflage developed from studying Krell visual spectrum limitations, and they navigated the facility using stolen access codes extracted from captured Krell computer systems, and they placed charges with the precision of people who knew they would not get a second chance. When the depot exploded, it killed 200 Krell warriors and destroyed enough supplies to cripple operations in that sector for months, and more importantly, it sent a message that humans could reach the Krell anywhere and the hunted could. Strike back news of the attacks spread through Krell communication channels, and for the first time, uncertainty appeared in their tactical discussions, because apex predators did not expect prey to hunt them in return. But Chen was not satisfied with defense or even successful raids, because she understood that wars were won not by tactics but by strategy, and the strategy required was simple: make the cost of hunting humans higher than the Krell were willing to pay. "We need to shift their perception," she told her senior staff during a classified briefing. "Right now they see us as prey that fights back, but we need them to see us as predators that should be avoided." And the distinction mattered, because fear was more powerful than respect. The next phase began with psychological warfare, as human forces started broadcasting footage of successful counterattacks across captured Krell communication networks, and the message was clear. Every Krell raid would be answered with devastating retaliation: a Krell warpack that destroyed a human listening post found their mothership ambushed by 3 human frigates, using tactics that exploited Krell overconfidence, and the battle was recorded and transmitted across human space as proof that the aliens could be beaten. Another Krell commander, who boasted about his hunting prowess on Imperial communications, was targeted specifically by human intelligence, and his ship was tracked and destroyed. And his final moments were broadcast to show other Krell that reputation meant nothing against human determination. But the most effective weapon was not military, but informational, because humans began contacting other species conquered by the Krell and offering alliance and weapons and training, the promise that together they could overthrow their oppressors, the Dexians, whose homeworld burned under Krell occupation. Received shipments of human weapons and tactical training, and within weeks they launched coordinated uprisings that tied down 3 Krell warpacks. Zephron, Hivemind, which had been enslaved for generations, received human technology that allowed them to shield their telepathic communications from Krell monitoring, and suddenly the slaves knew everything their masters planned across the Krell Empire's subject species began to resist, because humanity had given them something more valuable than weapons. They had given them hope that resistance was possibly fictional. Watched these developments with growing alarm, because his superiors in the Dominion Council still treated Earth as a minor problem, but he could see the strategic picture changing, and humans were not fighting like prey anymore. They were fighting like Earth's ancient generals, whose names Thexanol had researched in captured human databases. Sun Tzu, who wrote that all warfare was deception, and Genghis Khan, who built empires by turning enemies against each other, and Napoleon, who won through speed and concentration of force. "We should negotiate," Dexanol told the council during his next report. "These humans are more dangerous than any species we have encountered, and their capacity for organized violence suggests they evolved in constant warfare." But Overlord Krextil dismissed his concerns. "They are still prey," Krextil insisted. "And prey does not dictate terms to predators, so continue your operations and stop bringing me excuses," and the communication ended before Dexonal could argue further, so he continued his raids, but now he studied human tactics with the attention they deserved, and what he found disturbed him, because humans did not fight with honor or glory, but with cold efficiency, and they seemed willing to sacrifice anything to achieve victory. Human colony under attack had evacuated civilians but left soldiers behind, who fought a delaying action that cost 50 Krell lives while buying time for the evacuation fleet to escape. And when Thexanol finally took the colony, the defenders detonated hidden charges that collapsed the main structure. No prey species did this, and Thexanol realized with growing certainty that humanity was not prey at all, but something far more dangerous. They were predators who had been forced to hunt their own kind for survival, and now they had turned those skills against an external enemy. The moment of clarity came when his warpack walked into a trap on what appeared to be an abandoned human agricultural world, and the humans had used their own distress beacon to lure the Krell into a canyon rigged with explosives and automated weapons. Half his pack died in the first 30 seconds, and the Senil barely escaped by abandoning his. The Krell warship emerged from the dark space like a predator stepping into moonlight. Its hull scarred from 1,000 hunts across 100 worlds and commander. The Sentinel stood at the observation deck watching the blue planet below with eyes that gleamed with anticipation, because this was what his species lived for. The hunt and the kill and the glory that came after. For 3,000 cycles the Krell Dominion had ruled this section of the galaxy, and they had done so not through diplomacy or trade, but through simple, brutal dominance. Because the Krell were born hunters with armored hides that could withstand plasma fire and claws that could tear through steel and reflexes so fast they seemed to move between heartbeats. Earth had been cataloged 2 cycles ago when a Krell scout ship passed through the system on a mapping expedition, and the reports had made. They seemed to laugh because the dominant species there seemed almost designed to be prey. They had no natural armor, and no claws and no venom, and they were so slow that a Krell youngling could outrun their fastest warriors. These humans are soft. His second-in-command, Vexther, said while reviewing the biological scans, and Nexenal had agreed completely. Because every indicator suggested this would be an easy hunt, and perhaps even boring compared to the armored. The Exians of the Forge Worlds, or the Hivemind Zephrons, who at least fought with coordinated intelligence, the Dominion Council had given Nexenal permission to begin culling operations, and the plan was simple. Strike remote settlements first, and test the prey's response patterns, and then broadcast the best hunts across the Empire, because nothing entertained the Krell masses like watching lesser species realize they were doomed. The first attack came without warning on a human mining colony orbiting a frozen moon, and Nexenal led his warpack personally because he wanted to judge the quality of this prey himself. And when they breached the colony's hull, the humans inside scattered exactly as prey should, and some tried to fight with primitive kinetic weapons that barely scratched Krell armor. They die too, Isili Vexther complained as he lifted a human engineer off the ground with one clawed hand, because the creature weighed almost nothing and snapped like a dried twig when pressure was applied, and within minutes the colony was silent, and the warpack returned to the ship with footage that would make excellent entertainment. But something bothered Nexenal, even though he could not name it, and it was the way one human had looked at him before dying. Not with the terror he expected, but with cold calculation, as if memorizing every detail of Krell anatomy and battle tactics for some future purpose that would never come. The second hunt targeted a human freighter carrying mining equipment through an asteroid field, and this should have been even easier because the ship was unarmed and slow. And when the Krell boarding pods attached to its hull, the Xonal expected the crew to surrender immediately, as sensible prey did instead. The humans fought in their narrow corridors with weapons improvised from mining tools, and one of them actually wounded a Krell warrior by detonating a plasma cutter at close range, and Nexenal had to admit this showed more spirit than most prey species demonstrated in their final moments. Commander, one of his warriors called through the communication system, they have barricaded themselves in the engine room and are threatening to overload the reactor. And Nexenal felt a flicker of irritation because this was supposed to be a hunt, not a negotiation. Tell them we will make their deaths quick. If they surrender now, he ordered while moving through the ship's corridors. Because even mercy was a form of dominance when offered by a superior species to an inferior one. The response came not in words but in action, as the entire rear section of the freighter exploded with enough force to damage 2 Krell boarding pods and kill 3 warriors, and Nexenal barely escaped by detaching his pod seconds before the ship tore itself apart back on his warship. He reviewed the footage in silence. Because this was not normal prey behavior, and prey that was cornered should beg or flee or accept death, but these humans had chosen destruction over capture, and that spoke to something deeper than simple fear. They are defective, Vexenal suggested, While treating a burn wound across his shoulder, their survival instincts are broken, and they choose death over submission like animals with brain parasites. And this explanation satisfied most of the warpack, but Vexinal kept watching the final. Moments before the explosion, in those moments he could see the human captain's face through the viewport, and the expression there was not madness or despair, but grim satisfaction, as if dying on their own terms was somehow a victory worth celebrating. Third and fourth hunts followed similar patterns with human settlements, fighting beyond any reasonable point and sometimes destroying their own infrastructure to deny the Krell. The satisfaction of claiming it intact, and each time Vexinal's unease grew, because this was not how conquered species behaved. The broadcasts went out across the Dominion anyway, because the Council wanted citizens to see the new hunting grounds being opened, and Krell across a dozen worlds watched humans die in there. Settlements and ships, and the entertainment value was high, even if the humans refused to run properly. But the Cunal noticed something else in the wreckage of human positions. They always destroyed their communication equipment last, which meant they were sending data somewhere until the final possible moment, and when he mentioned this to Vexther, his second dismissed it as irrelevant. "What can they do with data?" Vexther said while sharpening his claws on a grinding stone. "They cannot grow claws or armor from information, and we have hunted species with far better technology than these primitives," and logically this was true, but this Exinal instincts whispered warnings his mind could not yet articulate by the 10th raid patterns began emerging that troubled him, because human defenders were starting to predict Krell tactics, and one settlement had actually prepared an ambush, using explosive charges placed where Krell warriors would naturally take cover, and two of his best hunters died when the charges detonated simultaneously. "They learn quickly," he told the Council during his next report. "Perhaps we should accelerate the culling before they adapt further." But the overlords laughed at this suggestion, because what could Prey learn that would matter against apex predators? "You grow soft, Exinal Overlord," Crextill said through the communication channel. "Finish your hunt and stop seeing threats in every shadow, because the Krell have never failed to dominate. Lesser species in these humans will be no different," and the words carried the weight of command that could not be questioned. So Vexinal continued the raids and tried to ignore the growing evidence that something was changing, because human resistance was becoming more organized and their tactics more sophisticated, and they had started targeting Krell supply ships instead of just defending their own positions. Then came the incident at Mining Station 47, where a human defense force had somehow obtained Krell weapons from previous raids and used them with disturbing effectiveness, and for the first time in his long career, Vexinal felt something he had not experienced since his youth: uncertainty about the outcome of a hunt standing on his command deck watching the blue planet below. He wondered if perhaps the initial assessment had been wrong, but he dismissed the thought immediately, because the Krell were never wrong about prey, and these humans would learn their place in the natural order soon enough. What he did not know was that every raid and every battle and every piece of Krell technology recovered was being studied by human scientists and military strategists, who were doing what humans had always done best: learning from their enemies and preparing to turn weakness into strength through determination and innovation. The hunt was only beginning, but already the roles were starting to shift in ways Vexinal could not yet imagine.